Alright guys, so we're going to move on with our ecology notes, and this particular set is kind of like a hodgepodge. It's got some different types of information, but it's all ecology related. And so we're going to take a look at just some general factors that can affect the ecosystems, as well as specifically we're going to focus on population ecology. And so we're going to start with cycles. This is something you've been learning for quite a while, especially things like water cycle. And so in order for organisms to survive, there are certain things that they have to have. Like they have to have water, they have to have food, they have to have certain compounds and elements like carbon, nitrogen. And so these cycles are just going to be the ways in which these particular compounds are kind of moved throughout the environment. Now, one thing I want to stress is in the last lesson, we covered energy and we looked at trophic levels. And in energy, it is a one-way flow, okay? Energy flows in one direction. So remember your food chains, you start with the sun or some chemicals. That's going to pass to your autotrophs, and then from your autotrophs, it will pass through the various levels of consumers to decomposers and so forth. Now, the energy is not recycled. It does not start back over. Remember that as you're moving from trophic level to trophic level, a lot of that energy is lost in the form of heat, or it's going to be used by the consumer. And so only that 10% was actually passed from one trophic level to the next. So by the time you get to the high levels in a trophic structure, essentially there's very little energy that is remaining. So it is decreasing steadily, and it does not start back over. When decomposers decompose, they're not returning energy. Now, that is going to be different from these geochemical cycles. So in this case, they are going to be recycled and transformed into different forms. And so if we take this word and break it down, we have bio. Bio, of course, means life. We have geo. Geo refers to earth. And then chemical, of course, refers to chemical. So these biogeochemical cycles are a combination of life processes, geologic processes, and chemical processes. So while nutrients and matter like water and other minerals can be recycled, energy is not recycled. It's a one-way flow. So we're going to start with the water cycle, and I know this is something that you're probably already familiar with. With each cycle, we're going to talk about the processes that occur within it, and we're also going to talk about essentially how humans can disrupt it or cause harm to it. And so water moves all throughout the earth, from the land to the water to the air, through various processes. And so we have evaporation and transpiration. This is when it goes from water to a gas. If you're not familiar with transpiration, we need to go ahead and get familiar. Transpiration is when it evaporates from plants. It evaporates from trees. Water evaporates from the grass. So transpiration is specifically the loss of water from plants. Condensation, of course, is when it condenses in the air and goes from the gas back to a liquid. Precipitation is when it falls to earth. And then once it falls back down, it can run off into a body of water. It can percolate, which means it trickles down over the soil and down into groundwater. And it, of course, can be stored underground as groundwater. And so how do we affect this cycle? Well, we can definitely overuse. If you are pumping water out of a well, you can take out too much. It can cause the land to sink. We can definitely overuse our fresh water. There's a ton of water on the planet, but only a small percentage is actually usable in its form that we find it in, the fresh water. So if we overuse the fresh water, then we're going to have to find some way to find another source. We can also pollute, and that's going to disrupt the water and the organisms that live in the water. So pollution, things like the release of fossil fuels, sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides, these are released anytime we burn. And these are going to interact with molecules in the air, and they're going to form acidic compounds. And so when it comes back down to earth, it's known as acid precipitation or acid rain. And that can affect the pH balance in bodies of water, which could lead to harming the organisms that live there. It can also affect rocks and statues, things of that nature. And then pollution can also lead to something called biological magnification. And this is where the toxins become more concentrated. So as you pass through the food chains, there are certain chemicals that are not digested. And so a lot of these pollutants, when they're consumed, as they're moving through the food chains, they are becoming more and more and more concentrated because they're not being broken down like other normal compounds that we eat. And so as they go from kind of like plankton in the water or, kind of small populations, plants, and they move up through those trophic levels, by the time you get to those high level consumers, they're actually rather concentrated. And so what you'll see as a result is you'll see things like fish kills or you'll see birds dying. And the reason why is because as they magnify in concentration, they become more and more toxic to the organism. And so it kind of looks something like this. And so you can see that the concentration is very low in the water, but as it's passing through the food chain, the concentration of those substances are steadily increasing. They're magnified. All right, next is the carbon cycle. And hopefully you remember from first semester that carbon is in all of our organic compounds. So we had our carbs, our lipids, our proteins, nucleic acids. So we are essentially carbon compounds. We have carbon in our skeletons. We have carbon in our sugars. We have carbon in our fats, carbon in our DNA. There's carbon all within us. And so we also find carbon in things like calcium carbonate, which you'll find in animal skeletons. We'll find it as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so there's definitely multiple forms in which you can find carbon. And it is essential that we take it in order to build all of these macromolecules. Now this one is not as pretty of a cycle. It's really not really a circular type of cycle. Instead, I have it broken down into processes that are going to remove carbon dioxide or decrease carbon dioxide in the air or water. And I have it broken down into processes that are going to release or increase CO2 in the air or water. And so notice I have some color coding here, okay? And so a lot of times we think, maybe green is good and red is bad. And in some cases, yeah, that's the case. But really what it is the green represents the biological processes. So remember, these are biogeochemical cycles. And since we are in biology, I kind of want to just give some emphasis to the living processes that contribute to the carbon cycle. So notice over here, there's only one living process that's removing carbon dioxide, and that is photosynthesis. And so this is one reason why these trees are really important in all of our plant life, is because they're actually removing carbon dioxide from the air, and then they're turning it into those sugars and other carbon compounds. Now, some other ways that carbon can be reduced is through deposition, formation of fossil fuels, formation of those animal skeletons. All of those are going to store carbon. Now over here we have respiration, which remember is kind of the opposite of photosynthesis. So we eat the sugars and we break them down in the presence of oxygen, and that leads to a release of carbon dioxide. Now there's nothing wrong with that. These are going to be kind of balanced for the most part, as long as we are not chopping down too many of our trees. And then decomposition, as living things die and decay, some CO2 is going to be released as well. We also have some geologic processes like erosion and volcanic activity. And then notice we have some red ones down here. And yeah, they could be considered the bad ones, but really what they are is this is where the humans have an impact. So how can we essentially mess up or alter or affect the carbon cycle? Well, when we burn these fossil fuels that are storing large amounts of carbon, it's going to put a lot of carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere. And when we cut down mass amounts of trees and vegetation, that is going to reduce photosynthesis, and therefore that is going to increase carbon dioxide. So these are definitely some of the non-natural ways that we can affect the carbon cycle. So as I mentioned, it's not necessarily a pretty circle. The arrows are kind of going in all different directions. So just kind of be familiar with those main processes on the previous slide. Now in terms of human impact, okay, global warming is typically connected to excess CO2 in the atmosphere, and it is connected to a natural process called the greenhouse effect. So this by itself is not bad, okay? The greenhouse effect is actually a good thing. So out in our atmosphere we have gases, and those gases actually trap heat. Okay, and this is one of the things that makes our planet a warm and livable planet. So the greenhouse effect is good. Now, the problem is that these greenhouse gases, which include things like water vapor and carbon dioxide, the problem is that we are increasing these well above the natural processes, okay? So essentially, when we increase our CO2 emissions, we're creating a thicker blanket. So these gases naturally create this warming blanket, but what we do with our burning of fossil fuels and cutting down large amounts of vegetation is we're increasing the CO2 in the atmosphere and therefore making that blanket thicker. And so over time, that's going to lead to a change in the global climate, okay? Now, what that can do is that can affect sea levels, that can change weather patterns. There's so many different effects of global warming. And while there could be some natural, humans definitely have played a role in increasing the greenhouse effect. All right, moving on to our next cycle is the nitrogen cycle. And once again, nitrogen is going to be one of those important components of some of our macromolecules. You will find it in every amino acid and therefore proteins, and we'll also find it in our nitrogen bases in our DNA. And so nitrogen gas is actually very abundant. So N2, about 78% of the air around you is going to be nitrogen gas. The problem is we can't breathe it in and use it like that, okay? It is not usable by living things. In order for nitrogen to be usable, it's got to be turned into compounds. So things like ammonia or ammonium or nitrites or nitrates or nitrites. And so we kind of have this big process that must happen in order for the nitrogen gas to be usable by living things. And so one of the most important processes that you need to know about the nitrogen cycle is the process of nitrogen fixation. And this is where the nitrogen gas, which is not usable, is going to be added to other materials to form compounds. So essentially the gas is fixed into a compound form. Now we can't do this, okay, but there are a special group of bacteria that are able to fix the nitrogen. They're primarily found in legumes, which are bean plants. And so this is going to be essential for living things to be able to get nitrogen. So first we have to be able to fix it or get fixed nitrogen, and that's going to be helpful because of bacteria. It can also be fixed in the atmosphere, and it can also be fixed by things like lightning or burning. Now, once the nitrogen is fixed, it's going to be in the soil. The nitrogen compounds can be taken in by plants. As we have the trophic levels and the food chains, the consumers eat the plants or the consumers eat another consumer that ate the plant. And so the nitrogen compounds can pass through the food chains. And then as things die and decay, when the decomposers break down the bodies, it will return those nitrogen compounds to the soil. Now, there's also another process that's the opposite of fixation. It's called denitrification. There's another type of bacteria that can convert it back into gas. And once again, this is not a just perfect circle kind of cycle, okay? In like DC Environmental, we do a nitrogen cycle game or lab, and you can kind of get stuck going from this, one place to the same place to the same place, because it's not a 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of thing. So in general, though, the nitrogen gets fixed. It then becomes usable. It passes through the food chains. It can be returned to the soil by decomposition. It can also be returned to the atmosphere through denitrification. All right, so down here we have our bacteria that are going to be responsible for fixing it. Once it's fixed, the plants can use it, and it can be returned through decomposition. Okay. Now, how do we mess it up? How do we affect it in a negative way? Well, we can do that from the overuse of nitrogen compounds. Now, there's a difference between like natural fertilizers, like throwing manure somewhere, versus a commercially made fertilizer. You can also create your own compost. That's going to be a healthy, natural fertilizer. But the problem comes when we're using a lot of these commercially made fertilizers. And essentially, a fertilizer is nitrogen compounds and phosphates, okay? And so when we use these, they can run off into bodies of water. And just like they make plants grow, they also make algae and photosynthetic bacteria grow like crazy. This is called eutrophication, and it can lead to an algal bloom. Now, it can grow to the extent where it literally blocks the sun and could keep sunlight from entering a body of water. It could also lead to an overgrowth of algae to the point where they can't be supported. And when they die and decay, it consumes oxygen out of the water ecosystem. And so, as a whole, what an algal bloom can do is it depletes oxygen in that ecosystem, which means organisms that are relying on oxygen are going to be affected and very likely die from that. All right, a little shift. So we've talked about things like carbon and nitrogen. There's also a phosphorus cycle, but it's pretty much just between soil and rock and living things. But essentially, ecosystems are going to be affected by the nutrients that are available. So even if all the nutrients but one are readily available to the producers, if even one is limited, it's going to affect what we call the primary productivity. So if you're being productive, that means you're doing something, you're accomplishing something. So productivity is essentially how much food are the producers producing, okay? So at what rate is organic matter, that's going to be things like glucose, at what rate is glucose being made by our autotrophs, okay? Now, this is going to be a great measure of ecosystem success because if your producers are doing well, normally everything else is doing well along with them. Now, things that can affect productivity are things like those nutrients, light, water, temperature. And so in order to have a good, stable, thriving ecosystem, you want to have a high primary productivity. Now, secondary productivity is going to be how much of that energy is then converted to the consumer's biomass. And so we could also look at the consumers. Now, one of the things you could be expected to calculate, we won't be doing a whole lot of math here, but one thing that you could be expected to calculate is what's called the net primary productivity. And so think of this like your paycheck, okay? If you have a job, you go to work, you make a certain amount of money per hour, and you get your paycheck based on the number of hours that you worked. But that doesn't mean all of the money is coming to you, okay? Because of course we take out things for taxes, and so therefore your paycheck may not be as high or will not be as high as what you actually made. The same thing applies here. So you have your gross primary productivity, which is the total. How much are the producers producing? But producers are living things too. They also need to make energy, and so the producers are going to use some of that for themselves, okay? The plants are going to have to do cellular respiration. They're going to have to make energy for themselves. And so to get the net, which is what's available to everything else, you take how much the producers made, you subtract how much the producers used in respiration, and that will give you your net primary productivity. So the primary productivity could be affected, like we said, by many factors. The climate can affect it, the atmospheric composition. It is the basis for all food chains because all of your consumers are reliant on these producers. And so the higher the productivity, the more successful that ecosystem is probably going to be. All right, now we're going to do a quick shift into population ecology. So just to kind of recap, a population is a group of the same organisms, like a species, an interbreeding group typically. And so population ecology just looks at a specific population. And the way we can study them is by looking at things like population density, how they're distributed, how big is the population, and what are some of the demographics of that population. So we're going to start with density, and density is how many per unit area. So it's not just how big is the population, but essentially how compact is that population. You could have 10 trees per acre, or you could have 100 trees per acre. Okay, so notice it is per unit area. And so the population density is going to be affected by things like birth rate and immigration, which is movement in, as well as death rate and immigration with an E, which is movement out. And so if your birth rate and immigration are higher than these, then your population is going to be growing and becoming more dense. Dispersion is kind of how they're spread out in an area. The most common is clumped, where you kind of see like groups of organisms living together. Think of like ant hills. You know, you have clumps of the ants here and clumps of the ants there. Some populations will demonstrate a uniform dispersion, which is typically when you have territorial type organisms, and so they try to spread out to defend their territory. And then you have random, which means there's no method to the madness. This is not quite as common. There's normally some kind of pattern in how they're dispersed. Demographics is the study of statistics within a population. There's like human demographics. In fact, the activity that you're doing tomorrow is going to look at human growth rates. So we can look at things like birth rate and death rate. Is the population growing or declining? We can look at the age distribution. We can look at survivorship curves. And so the way these survivorship curves work is essentially where do you have your high death rate, or what is your death rate over time. So a type 1 type of population has a high death rate in older groups, and that's like us. You know, for the most part, we have pretty good survival from younger ages, and then as we get older, that death rate is going to increase. The opposite of that is going to be a type 3, and this is where you have organisms that are, you know, producing lots and lots and lots of babies, like plants. They produce a lot of seeds, but they aren't all going to grow up to be an adult tree. Or something that lays like hundreds of babies, things like, you know, fish, a lot of your insects, amphibians, things like that. And then you have type 2, where it's kind of just a steady death rate over time. And so here's an example of what they look like. So there's type 1 for humans, okay? So you can see that, you know, the death rate is increasing right here. Here in the type 3, we have a pretty sharp death rate, and then it kind of slows over time, whereas the type 2 is just kind of steady. When you're looking at age structure diagrams, you look at males and females in the population. I think there's an example of a question like this in your study guide, but you can kind of determine if that population is growing or declining or stable. So if you have more younger people in the population, that means that as they age, we're going to have an increase in population. Notice here that it's kind of even throughout, which means this population is remaining relatively stable. You're pretty much replacing the older people that are dying with your younger groups. And then if your population looks like this, if you don't have a lot of young people, then your population is actually going to decrease because there's not enough young people to replace the old people who are passing away. All right, and looking at growth, there's two main types. We have exponential and logistic. Now, these are just general kind of growth curves. They're not necessarily exactly what you'll see in an actual population, because real populations are going to have, you know, highs and lows, and they're going to kind of move from, you know, going above and below and increasing and decreasing. They're not going to be a pretty perfect curve. But in general, you will typically see kind of one of two growth patterns. You'll see exponential growth, and this is what you will see when you have ideal conditions. There's plenty of food, plenty of space, plenty of resources. And so essentially the population can kind of like double. Bacteria commonly will show exponential growth. Almost a lot of populations will show exponential growth in the beginning when they are in an ecosystem. The problem is they grow, they double, they grow. And as they grow, they're growing faster. Okay, so what happens is we end up with this J-type curve. And so it's a steady increase, and it's increasing at a faster rate. Now the thing is this occurs under ideal conditions, and ideal conditions cannot go on forever. Okay, eventually there's going to come a time when those resources are becoming limited, because that population is going to get to a point where there's not enough food to support all of them. There's not enough space. There's not enough water. There's not enough of something or many things. And so logistic growth curve kind of shows this exponential growth pattern, but we know that it can't go on forever. So as those resources become limited, it begins to level off and create this S-shape curve, okay? So to me, the logistic is more logical in that that exponential growth cannot continue forever. And so what you see is this S curve, and it begins to level off where the birth rate and death rate are pretty much about the same. And so one of the things that you'll find on a logistic growth curve that you won't find on the exponential is something known as the carrying capacity, okay? And the carrying capacity is that point at which that graph levels off. It's essentially the max number that that environment can support. And so once it levels off, let's say that the carrying capacity was 10,000, that population is going to fluctuate. It's not like it's going to hit 10,000 and just hit pause. You're still going to have births and deaths. You're still going to have disturbances from the environment. You'll have good seasons and bad seasons. But essentially, if you have your population numbers going over carrying capacity, that means you have more than can be supported. So that'll lead to a decline and a fall below. And then once you fall below, there's more resources available, and so a lot of times that will trigger a growth spurt. And so in reality, your graphs can fluctuate. But in general, you see the exponential J curve or you see the logistic S curve. And so depending on what type of population density a group has, you will see different types of selection. Now what we're talking about here when we say selection is referring to like natural selection. This is not something the organisms or the populations choose for themselves, but depending on like what size population they have, there will be different traits that will be selected for. So we have K selection and R selection. Now K is the symbol for carrying capacity, okay? So K selection is going to occur when a population is at or near carrying capacity. They are high density. They're probably right there at that carrying capacity line. And so nature is going to favor traits that allow for better survival. In a high density type of population, you're going to have a lot of competition because not everyone is going to survive. You have this cap off. And so traits that give organisms a competitive advantage are going to be favored. And so you're going to favor competition. You're going to favor the ability to effectively use resources. You're going to have fewer offspring with more care. And so we would be like a K selected, even though we're not necessarily at carrying capacity, we have fewer offspring and put a lot of care into them. A lot of your larger mammals are going to be K selected. Now R selection is going to occur when you have a population that is well below carrying capacity, so they have room to grow. And if that's the case, it's going to favor reproduction, 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 okay? So R selection is kind of a lower density, well below carrying capacity. It's all about making the babies, okay? So you're going to see more offspring and less care. You're going to see an earlier sexual maturity, more babies produced at a time, a higher ability to reproduce, kind of a faster turnover. And once again, the organisms aren't choosing these things. Just over time, depending on that population, natural selection will take its course. And last but not least, we have limiting factors. Okay, so what could keep a population from just growing indefinitely? Okay, there's going to be factors that keep population growth in check. And we could have density-dependent factors that are going to decrease population growth, or density-independent factors. There's always going to be that cap off, and it's normally related to resources in some way. Now, density-dependent, it depends on the size. Okay, so in a density-dependent situation, the size of the population matters. The bigger and more dense the population, the more they will be affected by these factors. So a lot of these are going to be biotic factors, things like competition, the predator-prey relationships, parasites, disease. If you think about it, where would disease spread more? In a very highly populated city like New York, or a small town like Texarkana, Texas, or New Boston, Texas, or something like that. So the more people you have, the more contact you have, the faster that disease is going to spread. So a lot of your density-dependent factors, they're going to affect larger populations more, and they're typically going to be some biotic factors. Whereas density-independent, it doesn't matter how big that population is, they're going to affect all population sizes the same. If you have something like a natural disaster, a tornado comes through, you have something like a tsunami, you have a drought, those types of things, whether it's 10 butterflies or 10,000 butterflies, if they all lose their home, they all lose their food sources, they're all going to be affected in a similar way. Okay. And that is going to wrap up our second lesson for ecology. So tomorrow you're going to be doing a graph on human population and answering some questions. And then after that, we're going to take a look at our essay, which is over biomes. So I'm going to make a separate video for that one. It's going to be an essay that you kind of write on your own and you'll turn in the day of the test. And so I'll give you some more information on that shortly. I hope you guys have a great day, and I will talk to you soon.